The mother placed a camera in her recently deceased daughter's coffin because she missed her so much. One day, when she checked the camera, she was shocked and immediately called the police. "You could have done more, Sarah. You could have saved her." The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she pushed open the door to her mansion. The sharp creak seemed louder in the silence of the house, a home that now felt like a hollow shell of what it had once been. Her hand lingered on the doorknob, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She hadn't cried this much since the day Susie was born, a day filled with both pain and unmeasurable joy. Now, the pain had returned, but this time, it brought no joy with it. She closed the door softly behind her, almost as if the quiet would somehow keep the memories at bay. It didn't. They crashed over her like waves, relentless and unyielding. Each step she took through the grand hallway reminded her of Susie's laughter, of how her daughter used to run barefoot across the marble floor, despite Sarah's constant warnings. Sarah dropped her purse onto the small table near the stairs, her fingers brushing against the family photo that stood there. She froze, her gaze locking onto Susie's bright smile. "I should have done more," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her hands trembled too as she lifted the frame closer. The sight of George standing beside her in the photo felt like a stranger's presence now. She set the frame down, turned away, and wandered into the living room. There, amidst the dim light, her eyes landed on the doll sitting on the armchair. A sudden ache shot through her chest. "I remember the first time you saw it," she murmured aloud, speaking to the empty room as though Susie could still hear her. "Your eyes lit up, and you begged me to let you keep it close, always." The doll, with its porcelain face and delicate features, had been the centerpiece of Susie's last birthday. Sarah had scoured every store in the city to find the perfect gift, something that would make her daughter smile from ear to ear. She never could have guessed how important that gift would become. She approached it slowly, her fingers reaching out to touch the tiny camera hidden within one of its glassy eyes. At the time, it had seemed like a harmless novelty, a way to let Susie play spy games. Now, it was a relic of a moment Sarah couldn't let go of. She sank onto the couch, the doll cradled in her lap. The house was still, too still. She had grown used to the sound of Susie's voice, filling every corner of the space, from her playful arguments about bedtime to her questions about the world. That voice was gone now, replaced by the weighty silence of grief. George's voice cut through her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his face a careful mask of sympathy. "Sarah," he said gently, "you should rest. You've been up since the funeral." Sarah glanced up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Rest? How do you rest after burying your child, George?" He flinched, his composure cracking for just a moment before he moved closer. "I'm not saying it's easy, but sitting here, torturing yourself, it's not going to help." He crouched down beside her, placing a hand on her knee. She pulled away instinctively, clutching the doll tighter. "I need time," she said, her tone colder than she intended. George hesitated, then rose to his feet with a sigh. "I'm here if you need me." She didn't answer. She wasn't sure if she wanted him there. Left alone again, Sarah turned her attention back to the doll. She hadn't told George about the camera she had installed in it. It had been a last-minute decision, a strange impulse born out of a desire to hold on to every possible piece of Susie's life. She remembered standing in the toy store, testing the tiny device with the help of an eager clerk. He'd shown her how to connect it to her phone, how to retrieve the recordings. "It's just for fun," she'd said at the time, laughing as Susie clutched the doll excitedly. But it wasn't fun anymore. Now, it was a lifeline, a chance to see her daughter one last time. The house was silent, but Sarah's thoughts roared louder than any storm. She sat frozen on the couch, the doll still in her lap, its lifeless porcelain face staring back at her. Her hands shook as she picked up the phone again, staring at the screen like it held the answer to everything she'd lost. Her finger hovered over the playback button. Could it really be Susie? Or was her mind playing cruel tricks on her, twisting grief into impossible hope? The darkness on the screen flickered to life again. Her breath caught as the image sharpened. The confined space of the coffin came into view, the faint glow from the camera casting eerie shadows. And then she saw it. A tiny hand moved sluggishly across the screen, brushing against the smooth surface of the coffin lid. Sarah gasped, her body trembling as her heart seemed to stop and race all at once. There she was, Susie, her baby girl, alive. Her voice barely escaped her throat as she whispered, "Susie. Oh God." The faint sounds from the video reached her ears, a soft whimper, weak and muffled. Susie's small frame shifted, and though the image was blurry, there was no mistaking it. She was trying to get out. Her movements were slow, exhausted, but determined. Sarah's scream tore through the stillness of the room. She shot up from the couch, nearly dropping the phone in her frantic haste. Every nerve in her body screamed for action. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. Her hands fumbled with the drawer near the front door, where she kept her car keys. The jangle of metal sounded louder than it should, her frantic movements amplifying every noise. She gripped the keys tightly, her knuckles white, and turned toward the staircase. "Sarah?" George's groggy voice called from the bedroom above. She froze for a moment, then forced herself to keep moving. "Where are you going?" he pressed, his footsteps growing louder as he descended the stairs. She started, but the words caught in her throat. What could she possibly say? That their daughter, who they had just buried, was alive, that she had seen it with her own eyes. "Sarah," George said more firmly, his voice tinged with concern. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, staring at her. "It's the middle of the night. What's going on?" She turned to face him, clutching the doll like it was her lifeline. Her voice trembled as she said, "I have to go." George's brows furrowed, his confusion evident. "Go? Where? Sarah, you're not making any sense." She stepped toward the door, her hand gripping the doorknob tightly. "I'll explain later," she muttered, her tone sharp. "Wait!" His voice was laced with alarm now, and he moved closer. "Is this about Susie? Sarah, listen to me. You need to let this go. She's gone. Don't say that," she snapped, spinning to face him. Her voice cracked, raw with desperation. "Don't you dare tell me to let it go." He flinched, momentarily stunned by the intensity in her voice. "Sarah, But she didn't wait for him to finish. She yanked the door open and bolted into the night, her keys clutched tightly in her hand. The air was cool, biting against her skin as she climbed into the car. Her hands shook as she started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness like beacons. She didn't care if George followed or tried to stop her. There was only one thought in her mind now. Susie needed her. As she sped down the empty streets, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. Her mind raced as fast as the car. How long had Susie been in there, fighting for her life? How much time did she have left? The memory of Susie's weak movements played on a loop in her mind. She saw the tiny hand pressing against the coffin lid, heard the faint sound of her voice. Tears streamed down her face as she gripped the steering wheel. "Hold on, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mama's coming!" Sarah's hand shook as she fumbled to dial 911. Her breaths came in quick gasps, the cold air inside the car feeling like shards against her lungs. As the line connected, she struggled to steady her voice. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" The calm, detached tone on the other end of the line was a sharp contrast to the storm raging inside her. "My daughter," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "My daughter. She's alive. She's been buried alive. You have to help me." There was a pause. Sarah could almost hear the dispatcher's disbelief. "Ma'am, I need you to slow down. Can you tell me your location and explain?" "No." Sarah's voice rose, tears streaming down her face. "I don't have time to explain. She's in the cemetery on Oakwood Drive. Please, you have to send someone now." Another pause, longer this time, and Sarah gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white. "I'm dispatching officers to your location," the voice finally said. "But you need to stay calm and wait for—" "I'm not waiting," Sarah cut them off. "I'm already there." She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, not caring that the dispatcher was still speaking. Her foot pressed harder on the gas pedal as the cemetery gates loomed ahead. The tires screeched as she pulled into the empty gravel lot. The graveyard stretched out before her, bathed in cold moonlight. Sarah stumbled out of the car, her legs shaky but driven by a singular purpose. Her breath came in ragged bursts as she ran toward the section where Susie had been laid to rest. The sight of the freshly packed earth sent a shiver down her spine, but she didn't stop. She fell to her knees beside the grave, her hands clawing at the ground. "Help!" she screamed into the still night, her voice raw with desperation. "Somebody help me!" The sound of approaching sirens pierced the silence, growing louder with every second. Sarah's hands were already filthy with dirt by the time the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the cemetery. Several officers rushed toward her, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Ma'am, step back," one of them said firmly, his hand outstretched. "No!" Sarah cried, refusing to move. "My daughter is in there. She's alive! You have to dig her up!" The officer hesitated, his face a mix of concern and doubt. "Ma'am, are you sure?" "Do I look like I'm lying?" Sarah snapped, her voice trembling with fury and fear. "You're wasting time. Please, just dig." Another officer, older and clearly more seasoned, stepped forward. He studied Sarah for a moment, then nodded to his team. "Start digging. Now." The next few minutes felt like an eternity. The rescue team arrived quickly, armed with shovels and tools, and began to dig. Sarah stood back, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she watched the dirt fly. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. She whispered prayers under her breath, her lips trembling. "Please, let her be okay. Please, let me get to her in time." The shovel struck something solid, and the sound echoed in the stillness. One of the workers called out, "We've hit the coffin!" Sarah's legs nearly gave out beneath her. She took a shaky step forward, her eyes fixed on the spot where they were clearing away the remaining dirt. The lid of the coffin was finally exposed, and two workers carefully pried it open. "Careful!" Sarah yelled, her voice raw with emotion. "Be gentle." When the lid lifted, the air seemed to freeze. There, lying inside, was Susie. Her face was pale, her breaths shallow, but her chest moved. She was alive. Sarah let out a strangled sob as she climbed into the grave, reaching for her daughter. "Susie!" she cried, tears streaming down her face. Susie's eyes fluttered open, her voice barely a whisper. "Mama!" Sarah scooped her up, holding her close as though she'd never let go. "I'm here, baby. I'm here," she murmured, her voice breaking with relief. The paramedics moved in quickly, gently taking Susie from Sarah's arms to assess her condition. "She's weak, but she's breathing," one of them said. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately." Sarah followed as they carried Susie to the ambulance, her heart still racing. She climbed into the back, never taking her eyes off her daughter. Back at the house, George paced the living room, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. He had called Sarah's number 3 times already, but she hadn't answered. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. He glanced at the clock, each passing second intensifying his anxiety. Sarah sat in the cold, sterile waiting room of the hospital, her hands clasped tightly around the doll. The minutes dragged on like hours as she waited for news from the doctors. Her legs bounced nervously, and her eyes, bloodshot from tears and exhaustion, darted to the phone resting on the seat beside her. It vibrated briefly, another call from George. She ignored it. Her grip on the doll tightened as her mind spun, replaying the moment she had pulled Susie from that coffin. Her daughter's weak whisper of "Mama" echoed in her ears, but so did the lingering sense of dread. Susie hadn't just collapsed out of nowhere. There was something deeper, something sinister, and Sarah was going to find out what it was. The phone buzzed again, and this time she picked it up, but not to answer. Instead, she opened the app connected to the doll's camera. Her finger hovered over the saved video files, her chest tightening with both anticipation and fear. The first few seconds were quiet. Susie sitting at the table in her room, the doll propped nearby. Her laughter was soft and sweet as she hummed to herself, unaware of the danger about to unfold. Then George entered the frame. Sarah's heart clenched as she saw him lean down, his smile charming, his demeanor calm. She watched as he handed Susie a small glass filled with a pale liquid. "Drink it all," George said, his voice smooth, almost soothing. "It'll help you sleep better, sweetheart." Sarah's stomach churned. Susie hesitated for a moment, her small hand gripping the glass as she looked up at George with trust in her eyes. He nodded encouragingly, and, with a smile, she tipped the glass back and drank. The transformation was almost immediate. Susie's cheerful humming faltered as her movements slowed. Her hand shook slightly as she set the glass down. George stayed close, crouching beside her as if nothing was wrong. "I don't feel good," Susie mumbled, her voice faint and slurred. "You're just tired," George replied, brushing her hair gently. "Go lie down, okay?" Susie stumbled to her bed, her body weak and unsteady. George's expression shifted then, no longer warm or kind, but cold and calculating. He turned to the doll, staring directly into its camera, and spoke in a voice that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "You'll never understand, Sarah," he whispered. "I love you too much to share you with anyone, not even her." The phone slipped from Sarah's trembling hands, clattering onto the tiled floor. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the room spun around her. For a moment she couldn't think, couldn't process what she had just seen. George, the man who had promised to protect her, who had stood by her through her darkest days, had tried to kill her daughter. Not out of anger or malice, but because of some twisted, possessive notion of love. The betrayal hit her like a freight train, shattering any sense of safety she had once felt in his presence. The man she had trusted most in the world was a monster. Tears streamed down her face as she scooped up the phone, replaying the video just to be certain she wasn't imagining things. The evidence was undeniable. Her resolve hardened. Sarah stepped out into the hallway, her phone clutched tightly in one hand. Her voice was steady, though her hands still shook as she called the police. "I have evidence of a crime," she said, her tone cold and precise. "My fiancé tried to poison my daughter. I have the video to prove it." The dispatcher's response was immediate, promising that officers would arrive at her home within minutes. Sarah hung up and leaned against the wall, her eyes closed as she fought to keep her emotions in check. There was no time for fear or sorrow now. There was only action. Back at the house, George's pacing had grown frantic. He glanced at his phone again, muttering under his breath. Why isn't she answering? When the sound of sirens reached his ears, he froze. He moved to the window and peeked out through the curtains. The sight of flashing red and blue lights outside his driveway sent a wave of dread crashing over him. He backed away from the window, his mind racing. No, this can't be happening, he murmured. The knock on the door came next, loud and authoritative. George hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but it was too late. "George Calhoun," an officer's voice called out. "This is the police. Open the door." When George finally opened it, his face was pale but composed. He glanced past the officers as though expecting to see Sarah. "What's going on?" he asked, forcing a calm tone. There must be some kind of mistake. The officer stepped forward, his expression hard. "We have evidence linking you to the attempted poisoning of Susie Harper. You're under arrest." George blinked, his composure slipping for just a moment. Then he laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "So she found the video," he said, almost to himself. His smile was bitter as he held out his wrists for the handcuffs. "I guess it was only a matter of time." As they led him to the patrol car, George turned to one of the officers and said, "You don't understand. Everything I did for her, for Sarah." The officer didn't respond, his grip firm on George's arm. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft hum of machines and the faint beeping of Susie's heart monitor. Sarah sat by her daughter's bedside, her fingers gently brushing Susie's hair back from her pale, fragile face. She looked so small, almost swallowed by the crisp white sheets. But her breaths were steady now, no longer labored and shallow like they had been just days before. It had been a week since they pulled Susie from that grave, and Sarah had barely left her side. The doctors had assured her that Susie was on the mend, that her body was resilient, but the scars left by those terrifying hours in the coffin were not just physical. Late at night, when the hospital was its quietest, Susie would wake up screaming. Her small hands would clutch at the blankets, her wide eyes filled with terror as she gasped for air. "Mummy, don't leave me," she would sob, her voice breaking, and Sarah's heart would shatter all over again. "I'm here, baby," Sarah would whisper, pulling her daughter into her arms. "I'll never leave you. You're safe now." Susie would cling to her, her tiny fingers digging into Sarah's shirt as if letting go might mean losing her mother forever. And Sarah would sit there, rocking her back and forth until the cries quieted and Susie's breathing evened out. But every night as Sarah held her child, she could feel the weight of what had happened pressing down on her. The image of George's cold, detached expression haunted her, almost as much as the video of what he had done. A knock on the hospital door pulled Sarah from her thoughts. She turned to see a nurse standing there, a warm but professional smile on her face. "Miss Harper," the nurse said gently. "They're ready for you at the courthouse." Sarah's stomach tightened, but she nodded, leaning down to kiss Susie's forehead. "I'll be back soon, sweetheart," she murmured. Aunt Karen will stay with you until I return." Susie stirred slightly, her hand weakly reaching for Sarah's. "Don't go too long," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I won't," Sarah promised, squeezing her hand before stepping away. The courthouse was cold and imposing, the kind of place where even the strongest resolve could falter. Sarah stood outside the courtroom for a moment, her hands clasped tightly together as she tried to calm her nerves. She had never been in a courtroom before, never thought she would be standing here to testify against the man she once loved. When she walked inside, George was already there, sitting at the defense table. He looked different. His usually pristine appearance was disheveled, and his eyes carried a hollow, distant look. But when he saw Sarah, a shadow of his old confidence flickered across his face. Sarah avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the prosecutor who motioned for her to take the stand. As she sat down, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. The prosecutor's questions were straightforward, but each one cut deeper than the last. "Ms. Harper, can you confirm that the video evidence submitted to this court is authentic?" "Yes," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I recorded it myself using a camera hidden in my daughter's doll. And in this video, you witnessed the defendant, George Calhoun, administering a substance to your daughter that caused her to lose consciousness." "Yes," Sarah repeated, her voice sharper now. "I saw everything." The prosecutor nodded and turned toward the jury. "No further questions, Your Honor." When George's attorney stood to cross-examine her, Sarah braced herself. "Ms. Harper," the lawyer began, his tone measured, "do you believe Mr. Calhoun acted out of malice, or do you think his actions were driven by love?" Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What he did wasn't love," she said coldly. "It was obsession. Love doesn't hurt. Love doesn't try to take a child's life just to hold on to someone else." The lawyer paused as though considering his next move, but Sarah's words hung heavy in the air. The trial dragged on for days, but in the end, the evidence was overwhelming. When the judge announced George's sentence, life in prison without parole, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness. George's reaction was calm, almost indifferent. As the bailiffs led him away, he turned to Sarah one last time. "I told you," he said, his voice quiet but eerily steady. "Everything I did for you." Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. She simply turned away, refusing to let him see the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's story spread throughout the community. The horror of what had happened, the bravery it had taken to rescue Susie and face George in court. It all resonated deeply with those around her. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now came forward, offering support and kindness. Strangers left cards and flowers at her door, their messages filled with encouragement and empathy. Sarah found solace in their words, but her true strength came from Susie. Every time, her daughter smiled, hesitant at first but growing brighter each day. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. She knew they had a long road ahead. Susie's nightmares wouldn't disappear overnight, and the scars left by George's betrayal would take time to heal. But they would heal. Together. The house was smaller, tucked away on a quiet street that seemed to promise peace. Sarah had spent weeks searching for the right place, a home that didn't carry the weight of memories she couldn't bear to revisit. The mansion, with its grand hallways and empty echoes, had been too much. It was a shell of a life she no longer wanted. The day they moved, Sarah stood outside with Susie, watching as the last box was loaded into the moving truck. She knelt beside her daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Ready for our new adventure? She asked softly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Susie hesitated, her small hand slipping into Sarah's. Will it be happy there? Sarah forced a smile, though her heart ached at the question. I think it will, sweetheart. We'll make it happy. Together. The new house had none of the grandeur of the old one, but that was its charm. It was cozy, with sunlight streaming through wide windows that overlooked a small garden. Sarah spent the first few days unpacking and arranging while Susie explored every corner of their new home. It was slow work, but it felt purposeful. Each room they filled became a blank slate, a chance to rewrite their story. Sarah hung family photos in the hallway, carefully avoiding any that included George. "Mama!" Susie called one afternoon, holding up a picture of the two of them from her last birthday. "Can we put this one in the living room?" Sarah took the photo, her heart squeezing at the sight of Susie's bright smile. "Of course, baby," she said, kissing the top of her head. "That's a perfect spot for it." Sarah made a conscious effort to give Susie the joy she'd been robbed of. Afternoons were spent baking cookies in their small kitchen, flour dusting their clothes, and laughter filling the air. On weekends they visited the park, Susie's giggles echoing as she chased after butterflies. "Catch me, Mama!" Susie shouted one day, running ahead on the trail. Sarah laughed, pretending to stumble as she chased after her. "I'm too slow. You're too fast." For the first time in months, the weight in Sarah's chest felt lighter. She could see it in Susie too, the way her laughter came easier, her steps more confident. At night, when Susie still woke from nightmares, Sarah was there. She would hold her daughter close, soothing her with gentle words and soft lullabies until sleep returned. Each morning after, Susie seemed a little stronger, a little braver. One evening, as Sarah sat on the couch after Susie had gone to bed, she stared at the pamphlet in her hands. It was for a local support group for single mothers. She had picked it up at the grocery store, but she wasn't sure if she was ready. The idea of sharing her story, of reopening those wounds in front of strangers, made her hesitate. But as she looked around her new home, at the life she was trying to rebuild for herself and Susie, she realized she couldn't do it alone. The next day, she called the number on the pamphlet. The first meeting was nerve-wracking. Sarah sat in a circle of women, all of them with their own struggles etched into their faces. When it was her turn to speak, her voice wavered at first, but as she shared her story, she felt a weight lift. One of the women, an older lady with kind eyes, reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. "You're stronger than you think," she said. For the first time in a long while, Sarah believed it. She began attending meetings regularly, finding solace in the shared experiences of others. Each session left her feeling a little more grounded, a little more hopeful. Life began to settle into a new rhythm. Sarah started volunteering at Susie's school, helping with art projects and field trips. She even found herself smiling as she chatted with the other parents. Susie's teacher, a kind man named Mr. Davis, often stopped Sarah after class to share how well Susie was adjusting. "She's a remarkable little girl," he said one afternoon. "Resilient, just like her mother." Sarah's cheeks flushed at the compliment. "Thank you," she said quietly. The first letter came just a few months after George's sentencing. It was written in his familiar handwriting, the envelope smudged as if handled too roughly. Sarah stared at it for a long moment before tearing it open. Inside, George's words spilled out in pleading tones, apologizing, rationalizing, begging for forgiveness. He wrote of his unwavering love for her, claimed he had acted out of desperation, and begged her to see him not as the monster everyone else saw, but as the man who'd once promised to protect her. Sarah read every word, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. By the time she reached the end of the letter, she felt sick. She stood by the kitchen sink, staring at the letter for a moment longer before ripping it into tiny pieces. She let the scraps fall into the trash can, her chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. The second letter arrived weeks later. This time, she didn't open it. She didn't need to read George's excuses again. She tore it in half and tossed it out with the morning coffee grounds. By the time the third letter arrived, she didn't even pause to think. She shredded it without a glance and carried on with her day. Despite her resolve to move forward, the world outside didn't let her forget so easily. The media clung to her story like a lifeline, spinning every detail into headlines that Sarah wished she could ignore. At first, she had appreciated the support, kind words from strangers, thoughtful notes from neighbors. But with every kind gesture came the inevitable questions, the probing curiosity that bordered on invasive. "How did you not notice what George was capable of?" one reporter had asked during a grocery store ambush, their camera crew lurking nearby. "Do you feel guilty for trusting him?" Another voice had shouted from across her yard as Sarah rushed to get Susie inside. It felt like the world wanted her to wear her mistakes as a scarlet letter, a permanent reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Sarah kept her head high, but the weight of it wore on her. One evening, after Susie had gone to bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop. An email invitation blinked on the screen, inviting her to appear on a popular talk show. The host was known for their compassionate interviews, especially with women who had survived extraordinary hardships. The email promised a safe space for Sarah to share her story, to warn others about the dangers of misplaced trust and hidden abuse. She hesitated. The idea of opening up on such a public stage felt daunting, but deep down, she knew it was something she needed to do, not for herself, but for others who might be trapped in their own cycles of fear and silence. The studio lights were bright, almost blinding, as Sarah sat opposite the host. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her fingers twisting together nervously. The host's voice was warm, their questions gentle but direct. "Sarah, you've been through something unimaginable. What made you decide to speak out today?" Sarah took a deep breath, her voice steady, despite the emotion bubbling beneath the surface. "Because I want people to understand that it can happen to anyone. I thought I knew George. I thought he was someone I could trust with my life, with my daughter's life. But he wasn't. And the signs were there. I just didn't see them." As the interview went on, Sarah shared her story, the highs, the devastating lows, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding her life. She spoke not as a victim, but as a survivor, her voice growing stronger with every word. By the end of the segment, she felt a strange sense of relief, as if she had finally shed a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. Inspired by the experience, Sarah began to write. At first, it was just journaling, putting her thoughts and feelings onto paper, sorting through the chaos in her mind. But as the words flowed, she realized there was something more there. Her first book, a memoir of her journey, was published the following year. It was raw and honest, filled with lessons learned and hope for those still fighting their battles. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from women across the country, thanking her for her bravery, sharing their own stories, and finding strength in her words. Meanwhile, Susie blossomed. The nightmares grew less frequent, replaced by dreams of butterflies and sunny days. She joined a local theatre group, her confidence shining as she took the stage in school plays. One evening, as Sarah watched her daughter rehearse her lines, she marveled at how far they had come. "You're amazing, you know that," Sarah said, wrapping Susie in a hug after the practice ended. Susie giggled, tilting her head back to look up at her mother. "I learned from the best." The community Sarah and Susie had built together became a lifeline for others. What started as small gatherings of single mothers in Sarah's living room grew into a full-fledged organization, a network of support that offered resources, counseling, and a safe space for women and children in need. Sarah became a mentor, guiding women through their darkest moments and helping them see the light on the other side. Her past no longer felt like a burden. It was a tool, a way to make a difference. The story of Sarah and Susie is a powerful tale of resilience, love, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. It captures the heartbreaking journey of a mother who faces unimaginable betrayal and loss, yet finds the courage to rebuild her life and protect her child. Sarah's evolution is profoundly inspiring. From the depths of despair after discovering her fiancé's horrific betrayal to the determination to save her daughter and reclaim their lives, her strength is a testament to the enduring power of a mother's love. Her journey reminds us that even in our darkest moments, hope can guide us toward healing. Susie's growth from a frightened, traumatized child to a confident and vibrant young girl showcases the importance of unwavering support and nurturing in overcoming adversity. Together, they create a bond that not only helps them survive, but thrive, proving that love and perseverance can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. The story leaves a lasting impression, highlighting the importance of trusting oneself, recognizing hidden dangers, and drawing strength from community. It teaches a profound lesson. No matter how broken we feel, the power to heal and rebuild lies within us, especially when love and hope light the way forward. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.